My name's Carl Taylor, and in this program we're going to be looking at how to get your camera off of automatic mode and get creative by using it in full manual mode. Now we're also going to be looking at things like composition, shutter speeds, depth of field, light and much more. But first we need to understand the 6 essential requirements to record a photographic image, because by understanding those 6 things it's going to make photography a whole lot simpler. Now it doesn't matter whether you've got a little digital compact camera, a top-end SLR or a $50,000 studio camera, the same 6 things apply across all types of photography and all camera formats. So we're going to take a closer look at what those 6 things are. The 6 things that we need to understand are simple: light, optics, a subject, an aperture, medium, and time. Now light is all around us. It's what we find and it's what we use for most of our photography, but there are all different types of light, and we'll be looking at those in a little bit more depth later on. The subject is what we take photos of, and that's what we define as composition. Optics, well, they're quite simple. Those are the lenses that we put on our cameras, and they focus the light to a particular point so that we can capture an image more easily. Now an aperture is quite simply a posh word for a hole, and we use that hole or that aperture to control the amount of light that we capture in the camera. Time, we need to have a certain amount of time to be able to record something, and we control the amount of recording time using our shutter, and that's the shutter speed. And then the medium is quite simply what we record that light onto. Now in this program we're going to look at all of those things in a little bit more detail so we can really understand them properly. But before we do that, we're going to have a look at how cameras work. Okay, so let's look at how cameras work in relation to the 6 essential requirements that we need to record an image. Now here I've got an array of cameras in front of me, right from this little digital compact camera here, all the way up to this high-end, high-resolution studio digital camera. Now this one here is an older film camera, probably 20 years old, but essentially the mechanics in all of them is exactly the same. So let's have a look at that. Here I'm taking the lens off, and we can do that on all SLR cameras. Now the light has to travel through the lens and through the aperture. Now the aperture is simply a hole that we can control the size of to control the amount of light. After the light has passed through that, we need it to be controlled by a specific period of time. And that time we control using something called the shutter. And we can set the shutter speed to a designated time. So I'm going to set that on this camera to 1/4 of a second, and you'll see the shutter opening and closing there for 1/4 of a second. So let's set that for a little bit longer. I'll set that to 1 second, and there you can see the light would have passed through the shutter, through the lens, sorry, then through the aperture and through the shutter to be recorded onto the medium. Now one thing that you will notice there in the front of that camera is a little mirror. You can see the mirror there. Now that mirror is in all of these SLR cameras. You can see the mirror there as well, and there's also a mirror in this one here and in the other one there. Now that mirror is actually not part of the recording process. That mirror is just there so that we can view the image. Basically the light strikes the mirror at a 45-degree angle, bounces up and through the prism and out the viewfinder so that you're able to view the photograph before you press the button. And what happens is the mirror flips up out of the way when you actually take the photograph. There you go. Now that as the light then passes through to the medium, in this case, would have been recorded on the film that would have been at the back across there behind the shutter. Now, on modern cameras, that film has been replaced with a CCD sensor or a CMOS chip, a digital chip to record the light instead of film. And here, if I lift the mirror and the shutter out of the way, you can see that tinted piece of glass in there. That is the CCD chip that's capturing the light and recording the image. Now, it's a little bit difficult to see in that camera, so let's have a look at it on this larger studio camera, which has got a much larger CCD chip. And in this one, I can actually detach it, and there we go. That piece of tinted glass there is actually the CCD chip that captures the light and records the image. That's the recording medium in modern day photography. Now we're going to be talking about exposure. Now, exposure is quite simple. It's the brightness level or the darkness level of your final picture. And it's important to get that exposure, brightness level or darkness level, absolutely correct, because that is what's most pleasing to look at in the final photographs. Now, there are two main mechanical controls in your camera, as we know, which are the aperture and the shutter, and they serve to control exposure. The aperture controls exposure by enlarging or reducing the size of the hole to let the amount of light through, and the shutter opens and closes to control the amount of time that the light is allowed through, and both of those work together to control exposure. Now, I'm just going to do some shots in manual on the camera, controlling the shutter speed manually to get the right exposure. And there we go. Using the camera in manual, we can see there that using the screen on the back as a preview, we can actually check the exposure is correct. So this is a great tool for checking the exposure, whether you've got the brightness level too much or whether you've got the picture too dark. So I'll do another example now where I actually increase the shutter speed to a faster shutter speed, which will cut some light out, and that will give us a darker exposure. Here we have a typical view through an SLR camera viewfinder. Circled at the bottom is our shutter speed of 1/60th of a second, and on the right is our exposure scale, currently indicating that we have the correct exposure. Each marker above and below the midpoint indicates a 1/3 stop exposure change. That's it. I'm just going to increase that shutter speed, take the same shot again, there we go, and now we can see that one is considerably darker to the last shot. That was the shot before at the correct exposure, and that one's slightly underexposed. Now, if I increase the shutter speed even more to a faster shutter speed, we're going to lose even more light, and there we go. Hey presto, even darker that time. That was the one before, and that's the correct exposure. So you can see the changing in exposure by me manually adjusting the shutter speed. Now, we can also adjust that exposure level by manually adjusting the aperture as well, because they both work together. When you change one, you can compensate with the other. Now, exposure is often described in terms of a one-stop jump in exposure. That's one f-stop brighter or one f-stop darker. And in a little while, we're going to show you exactly what that means about a one-stop jump over and underexposed. That's it, great, Kirsty. But first, we need to show you how to adjust the shutter speed on your SLR camera by using the camera's main display screen and adjustment dial. Now, if we have a look closely, we can see here I can adjust the shutter speeds quite simply by rotating the dial. You see I'm in manual mode. Here's my shutter speeds, and here are the aperture settings. Okay, so I'm changing the shutter speeds to adjust the exposure. Now, that's on this pro level SLR camera. But if we take a look at, say, a more entry-level SLR camera, we can do exactly the same thing. Here's the control wheel, and here is showing me the shutter speeds, and there we can see I can change those shutter speeds manually, and that one is the aperture setting. So let's just do a quick test shot on this camera, just to prove the point that we can do exactly the same thing even on this entry-level SLR. Okay, now we can see from that one, it's not as clear as on the Pro level screen, but we can see that the image is slightly overexposed on that particular shot. And we can see that was at 40th of a second shutter speed. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drop that shutter speed down a little bit faster to 60th of a second to cut a little bit of light out. So let me just change that now to 60th. That's great, Kirsty, keep that there, perfect. And here we can see now we've got the exposure just about right on that preview screen there. Now, to fully understand exposure, you need to understand exposures changing in one-stop jumps. That means doubling the amount of light or halving the amount of light. Now, to simplify that, we've prepared some graphics so that we can make it really easy to understand. So I'm just going to grab those. Okay, here we go. Now, if we look at this graphic, we can see a picture that starts off very dark and is gradually getting lighter in exposure. Now, if we look at the numbers corresponding here, these are the shutter speeds. Here we see 1,000. If you see 1,000 on your camera, it actually means 1,000th of a second. Then we have 500th, 250th, 125th, all the way down to quarter, half, 1 second, and then even beyond that on most modern cameras. Now, what you'll recognize here is a pattern emerging. You can see that the number is being halved each time. Now, as that shutter speed slows down in these increments, we are doubling the amount of light coming into the camera to be recorded. That doubling of light each time is called a one-stop change. If we go the opposite direction, we're halving the amount of light. That's also called a one-stop exposure change, so it's important to remember that. Now, in the same respect, that happens when we change the aperture values as well. If we look here, starting with f32, we've got a very small hole, very small aperture, only letting a little bit of light through. And then as we go from f32 to f22, we've doubled the amount of light to f16 to f11. So those are also a full one-stop change, doubling the amount of light in that direction, halving the amount of light in that direction. So let's look at that on a camera lens. Here we've got the old Olympus lens with the aperture settings on the lens barrel itself, and you can see here f22, f16, f11, f8, some of the numbers that we just looked at. So let's look at those numbers in relation to what we can see through the lens. So if I put that in position there, we can see that the aperture is fully open, and then as I change it, we're closing the aperture blades down, right down till I get to f22 there, go back to f16, we're doubling the amount of light, to f11, doubling it again, f8, and so on. Now, on modern day digital SLR cameras, it's a little bit different. Those aperture changes are not on the lens barrel as such. Some cameras they still are, but on most of them you'll find them on the display screen. Now, earlier we showed you how we can change the shutter speeds here, and you can see that changing on the camera screen there, but here we have the aperture value and we can see f5.6. So what I need to do to change that in manual mode is hold the AV button in and then turn the wheel on the top, and then that lets us change. There we see f8, f11, f16 and f22, and if we look back at our display graphics here, you can see those numbers, 5.6, f8, f11, f16, and that is halving the amount of light in each direction. Now, what you would have noticed in that is that the actual numbers, there were extra numbers appearing in between these numbers. Those extra numbers allow us to control the exposure in 1/3 of an f-stop increment, and that's great for extra level of exposure control, but it is still really important to understand exposure changes in double the amount of light or half the amount of light, which are called full f-stop changes. Once you start to learn those full f-stop changes in exposure value, you'll really start to get to grips with this scale and that scale, and it'll start to help your understanding of exposure change much, much more easily. Look at me! As well as controlling the amount of light that we capture onto our medium, the shutter speed also controls the amount of time that we can capture that light for. And that allows us to freeze the action or allow the action to blur for creative effect. Here we can see that the relatively slow shutter speed of 1/30th of a second is unable to freeze the action of this moving subject. By following our subject with a camera at this shutter speed, we can create a sense of speed on our background whilst the subject remains relatively sharp. Here we used a fast shutter speed of 1/500th of a second, which has frozen the action but has resulted in a motionless looking image. By using a fast shutter speed, we'll be cutting down the amount of light that reaches our medium. So we'll need to use a large aperture to compensate. So to determine the right exposure level, you can use the camera's built-in light meter.
Round that tree, like that.
In this example, we can see that the picture is one stop underexposed on our exposure scale. To correct this, we open the aperture by one stop from 5.6 to f4, giving us the correct exposure. Here we open the aperture by yet another f-stop, resulting in one stop overexposure. By selecting a slower shutter speed, we'd be allowing more light to reach our medium. Now to compensate, we'll have to use a smaller aperture. Now again, you'd need to use the camera's built-in light meter to determine the correct exposure settings. And that way, you can find out what the ideal aperture and shutter speed combination is. But let's take a look at some semi-automatic modes that you might find useful. One of the great modes on modern day SLRs is TV or S mode, and this is a shutter priority mode. Now if you look on the camera here, we can switch the camera from program to TV mode there, and that means time value. And on this camera, it's on the digital display screen, and we can change the mode, and I can switch it there to TV mode. Now in TV mode, I can select the shutter speed that I'd like to use, and the aperture will change accordingly. So this is a fantastic mode if you are sort of using the camera in half manual and you're just deciding the shutter speed and the camera will decide the appropriate aperture. But I still recommend trying to use the camera in full manual when you can, and using the camera's built-in light meter to determine yourself the shutter speed and correct aperture combination, because that will get into a much better habit of using the camera in manual for full creative control. In this example, a fast shutter speed of 1/500th of a second has frozen the action. Here, a slow shutter speed of 1/30th of a second has resulted in a blurred image. But by using a shutter speed of 1/30th of a second and following the action using a technique we call panning, we have created a sense of motion in our picture whilst keeping our main subject sharp. When we need to use extremely slow shutter speeds of maybe several seconds, then we have to use a tripod in order to avoid camera shake. By using a tripod and long shutter speeds, we open up more creative opportunities, especially for landscape photography. Setting up your shot with the camera attached to the tripod can often be difficult, so it's a good idea to locate your shooting position first. This means it can make finding your composition a whole lot easier. Okay, we've got a great shot set up here. The light is working out really nice now. We've got that setting sun, and the balance of the light between the foreground and the horizon is balancing out absolutely perfectly. I've got a long shutter speed set so that I can capture some of the wave motion cascading around these rocks, and we're going to get some really good results of these waves just rolling in and trickling around those pebbles, and we've got this nice gloss finish over the top of the rocks. Just got to be careful with the splashes on the camera. We've got some protective filters on the end there, which are also helping darken the image down for me a little bit. But already we're starting to get the pictures that we were looking for a little bit earlier. Some great results there in the preview screen. Long shutter speed, good composition. And what I've worked out is this large pebble in the foreground, that large boulder, and then the next one, and then the series of pebbles out from there to give us the depth and scale that we need to attain in a good landscape image, to give us that sense of three-dimension, because obviously we're working in a two-dimensional format. So I'm just going to carry on shooting a few more while that sun's setting, because the light is looking really, really good. Got a big wave coming down now. Knowing which shutter speeds will work best for capturing wave motion is often a case of trial and error. I tend to use speeds of half a second up to 8 seconds, but I experiment with these speeds by using the camera in full manual. Got another big wave coming in now. It's one of the hazards of landscape photography. Right, we've got some really good results with some of those images that we've just shot there. I'm just going to see now that I've been forced back up the beach a little bit, but I'm not too worried because we've already got some great pictures in the bag. That was really good light, the sun set beautifully, the light balanced out as we expected and saturated in the sky really well. And we've got that bit of motion of the water around these lovely big pebbles and big boulders, the light glistening off it and reflecting. Fantastic finishing shot. I think it's time to go home now and have a cup of tea. Okay, what we're going to look at now is focus, because it's absolutely critical that you get a part of your image sharp and in focus. Now there are two ways you can do this. There are autofocus or manual focus. Now on manual focus, you'll find a setting on the lens here where you can flick it from AF to MF, that's autofocus to manual focus, and then it allows you to control the focus distance manually. You'll find that on this entry-level SLR camera as well. Autofocus to manual focus switch there, which then allows me to control the focus here. And then on this older film camera, this is manual focus only, which means we have to adjust the focus like so. Now you'll see a series of numbers around the lens barrel here, and those indicate the focus distance. Okay, so let's go back to autofocus on this camera, and I've got a series of pens lined up in a row going off into the distance. And I'm going to focus on the front pen so that you can see there's a difference in focusing at this point and focusing at the end point. So let's start off by focusing on that red pen. Okay, here we can see in this image how this pen is sharp in focus, but the other pens are drifting out of focus. Now if I do that exercise again, and this time I'll select the focus point on the orange pen. In this image, we can now see how the orange pen is sharp and the red one is out of focus. And if we look at the difference between the two images, there we can see red pen or orange pen in focus. So it's the same image, but I've selected two different focus points. Now that's done by using the focused selection points inside the camera. Inside these cameras and this type of camera here are a series of points that you can select as the focus point. Now the camera can do this automatically for you, where it will sense where there might be an object that you wish to focus on and it will select that point. Or you can tell the camera which focus point you would like to use or which one you'd like to select. Now quite often the focus point is in the center, so sometimes you need to focus on that position in the center by either pointing the camera at what you want to focus and then recomposing. Now, to activate the focus, you need to press the shutter button down part of the way. If you press it down just gently, you'll see the lens there trying to focus. You can actually see the numbers changing as the lens barrel is moving as the camera is looking for a focus point. Now, it's actually struggling at the moment to find a focus point because I've just got it pointing at a plain white area of the picture. And cameras and modern SLR cameras with autofocus, they need to see contrast or find contrast in an image to be able to focus properly and focus correctly. Let's demo that on this one. You'll see the lens barrel moving, there we go. And that's the camera trying to focus. If I point it at an actual object and press the button, there we go, it's found its focus. No problem at all. But as I said, on this one, I'd need to actually focus manually by adjusting it so, like this. Now, we're going to show you some graphics of what it looks like through the viewfinder of one of these cameras so that you can clearly see those focus points that I'm talking about and give you a better understanding of how you can switch from one to the other. Here, the left focus selector is highlighted in red, indicating this is the zone that will be used to focus. The green circle at the bottom of our viewfinder indicates that the camera has found its focus. Here, the center focus point is highlighted, indicating that the camera will focus on an object in this part of the picture. And finally, here I have chosen the right-hand focus selector, which will now force the camera to focus on the object on the right-hand side of our viewfinder. Now that we understand about focus and focus point selection, the next thing we need to cover is depth of field and apertures. Now, we've already looked at apertures and what an aperture does. We know that the aperture is a hole that we can control the size of to control the amount of light coming through. But the aperture also serves another creative process, and that is depth of field. Now, to demonstrate what depth of field is, if I focused on this pen here, on this line, and this was my focus line along here, and these pens were out of focus, I'll just do that, and I'll use an aperture that is fully open. With a large aperture setting of f1.4 and a shutter speed of 1/320th of a second, our exposure scale is indicating that we have the correct exposure. We focused on the red pen by using the right-hand side focus selector. Okay, now we can see in that image how the red pen is sharp and the other pens are drifting out of focus. But only the red pen is sharp because that's the point that I focused on. Now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to reduce the size of that aperture and close it down a little bit to increase depth of field. And let's see what that does. So I'm going to drop that aperture down from 1.4 in this instance down to 5.6. Right, now you'll find it very difficult to see the image because it's become a lot darker as I've dropped the size of the aperture and shrunk that down and reduced the amount of light coming through. So to compensate for that, I need to increase the amount of time. I need to open the shutter speed for a longer period of time. So I'm going to actually shut the aperture down even smaller on this occasion, right down to f16, which is a really tiny small hole. And I'm going to have to compensate and bring the shutter speed right down to get the right amount of light back in on the picture. Remember, we're using the camera in manual mode, and that's the best way to do it to learn. And we'll take the same picture again, and there we go. Now look at this. This is an incredible difference. Here we have the same photo, taken at f16, a very small hole, very small aperture size, and it's still focused on the red one. This was where we focused, but look how much sharper the image is all the way through. It's so sharp now we can even see through and see these pictures leaning against the wall in the background. Now let's compare that to the earlier one with the aperture fully open. That's the one where we didn't compensate with the shutter speed. And that's the one with the aperture fully open. You can just make out those pictures as a dark blob leaning against the wall in the background, and you can see how all those pens drift out of focus, whereas in that one, they're all sharp, running right through. Here in this example, we can see that a very small aperture has given us large depth of field, and our picture is sharp from the foreground through to the background. In this instance, the correct exposure was obtained with f22 and 1/40th of a second. A much more pleasing result occurs when we blur the background by using a large aperture. Now our model stands out from what was a busy background. To do this, I open the aperture to a larger size at f2.8. This let considerably more light through, so to keep the exposure correct, I selected a much faster shutter speed. So, if we had a focus point here, this was where we focused along that plane, and our focus range ran from about there to there with the aperture fully open. Now, as I shrunk that aperture down, the depth of sharpness increased way back here and all the way forward here. So our range of sharpness increased dramatically as we shut that aperture down. Let's just look at that on the graphics board that we used earlier. And here we shot it with a large aperture, and that gave us the shallow depth of field. And then we shut that aperture down and it became smaller and smaller until we got to f16 and we had a tiny hole, and that increased the depth of sharpness in our image by using the smaller aperture, but it also cut down the amount of light that was available, and to compensate we had to slow the shutter speed and lower the shutter speed to let more light in. And that is how we control depth of field, by using the camera in manual, selecting the aperture that we want to use to get the best depth of field. Now, full open apertures are great for portraiture. They blur the background and just bring the focus on the face or on the eyes of your subject, and they give a brilliant result for portraiture photography. And quite often they're really good for nature photography as well. Whereas in landscape photography, quite often we want larger depth of field because we'd like to have the depth of focus right from our foreground in our landscape extending right off into the distance. So we choose which aperture and which setting we desire based on the creative process required for the type of photography we're undertaking. When photographing the coast, remember to respect the sea. Check the tidal conditions and that the area you intend to shoot will be safe. There's a shot over there that we're going to nail absolutely peachy creamy as a landscape shot at sunset. Yeah, but where the tide is, I think given another hour or so, might be up another metre. And in about an hour's time, hopefully the light will be getting about right, maybe an hour and a half. But there's the side face of the rocks and all the fissures in the rocks. They're going to be catching the warm light. And there's a couple of rock gullies and there's this lovely green seaweed. And I think when the tides come up to the right level, there's going to be some water swaying and swirling over the top of these rocks and that green seaweed. And I don't think we'll get cut off there. I've had a good look around, so I think it's okay. And the sun should drop down to about the right position. I mean, we're lacking a little bit in the sky in terms of clouds and things for a bit of colour, but I think we'll get a really nice warm light on the rock face. So I think that'll be a good place to set up. Now this is a great scene here. Everything's set up. The tide's rising a little bit fast for my liking. And the swell's putting some waves over the rocks, so I'm going to have to be careful with the camera equipment. But we've got some good movement in the waves, some good motion. And I'm just really waiting now for that light to fall a little bit so it's not quite as intense, because as it drops and it gets lower down on the horizon, it's got more atmosphere to cut through, and that'll reduce its intensity and it'll give us a more balanced overall light and hopefully a more pleasing picture. So we're just going to hold on for a little while until it's a little bit closer to sunset. All the conditions are starting to come together. We've got great light on the water, a lot of movement in the water as the rising tide is swelling up and cascading over these rocks. Hopefully we're going to capture some of that motion. We've got a beautiful light on the side of this rock and coming off of this green seaweed in the foreground. I'm just trying to set up the right composition now, and hopefully we'll get something come out of this magical scene in front of us. We just have to be a little bit careful, because with the rising tide we have to be a little bit careful of these waves as they're coming up towards us, as you can see. We see some larger swell coming in now that we've got to be careful of. I'm going to move this camera bag out the way. There's a lot of value of equipment inside that. And then I'm going to be ready, if necessary, to grab my camera and tripod and basically leg it. I think any moment now that sun's going to break underneath and we can see razor light emanating out of the clouds, which looks really nice. I need to get a little bit of water coming up onto these rocks, and with the wave surges and swells that are coming, that keeps happening from time to time, but we have to be quite careful that we don't get a large swell come in and basically get us soaking wet and damage the camera equipment. So it's all working out quite nicely. I've got quite a good composition, I'm quite pleased with it, and I'm just really waiting for that right moment with the light and the waves moving up onto the rocks like that. And we're using a shutter speed now at the moment of about, I think it's 4 seconds. And that'll capture some of the motion in the waves as they're moving around over the rocks there. So I'm just going to keep shooting here. Here we can see the sun just coming out now on the underside of those clouds, which will add that little bit of sparkle that we need to the shot, and hopefully pick up a little bit of light on the edge of these rocks here. So I'm just going to wait for another wave to come in and come up and cover these rocks a little bit. And I'm always looking to make sure that I've got an exit point. Now I can see here, if a larger wave comes, that I can take a vantage point running up here just to get onto higher ground if necessary. Look at the colour coming up in those clouds now. Those razor light straying up into the sky there. We're capturing that, which is great. We just need that little bit of wave motion, and it does come in surges. You need to be careful, because as the tide's rising, the water is coming in surges. That light is not quite playing ball. It's being a little bit difficult. I'm going to have to actually increase the exposure a little bit, but rather than add time, we're at 4 seconds at the moment, and I quite like that shutter speed for capturing the motion that I need. So I'm going to open the aperture a little bit from f16, just a third of a stop to f14, to let a little bit more light in. We might get a little bit more richer colour in the clouds as the sun sets. Quite often the intensity of colours in the clouds increase as the sun goes lower down, and sometimes we actually get the best colours after the sun has set. careful to keep an eye on the conditions and know when it's time to go home. I'm out of here. I think the radio might have got a splash there. Just check it's all right. Is it wet? How wet? You wipe it off with that cloth. I was always fascinated by lenses and optics when I was a kid, and to be honest, I still am. I was always amazed at how lenses could magnify things that were far away and bring them right up into view. So what are lenses and optics? Well, quite simply, they are pieces of glass that have been shaped and polished to magnify and focus the light so that they're usable optical instruments. Now, lenses come in many different types, from simple magnifying lenses right up to super telephoto lenses that are often used by wildlife photographers and sports photographers. Now, lenses also come in a thing called focal lengths, different focal lengths. And it's those different focal lengths that give us great versatility in photography and allow us to take pictures of all sorts of different subjects. Now, to understand a little bit more about lenses and about focal lengths, we're going to have to go and take a closer look at some lenses. So, let's find out a little bit more about lenses and focal lengths. Let's have a look what I've got here in the old camera bag. Right, here we've got what's called a fisheye lens. This is a super wide angle lens, fisheye category lens. This one actually is just a little bit above that. It's a super wide angle lens, but not what's called a fisheye lens. And this one's actually a zoom lens and allows me to zoom from super wide angle and zoom up to wide angle. Next step up would be this one. This is a standard lens, and this one has a very wide aperture. Now, we've looked and learnt about apertures a little bit so far, and that's a great lens for gathering lots of light because it has a wide aperture. This next lens is what's called a short telephoto lens. And these are ideal for portraiture because they give a really natural looking appearance on people's faces, and the perspective on them is very flattering on people. This is also a really wide aperture lens, which means it can also gather a great amount of light. And then moving up the range here, I've got a telephoto lens, and this one's a zoom lens from 70 to 200, and that is not as big as a super telephoto. We're going up to 400mm for super telephotos, but I also have here a 2x converter, which is a great little accessory for putting with this lens to double the power of the lens. Now, one of the disadvantages of that is that it will lose a couple of stops of light, but it's great for getting that extra power. So all of these lenses allow us to do different things, and they all offer us what's called a different angle of view. So let's go and take a look at what we're talking about with angle of view. Let's imagine that's my camera lens, and here's my camera body, and I'm here taking the photos. Well, a fisheye lens would allow us to view from right out here to right out here. A super wide angle lens would allow us to view from right out here to say right out here. So it's still a really wide angle of view. And then going up to a standard lens will probably let us see from out here to out here. A short telephoto from out here to out here, so that's giving us that angle of view. And then super telephotos are a really narrow angle of view, just from about there to there. So the super telephoto lenses give us a really tight view and a highly magnified image. So when we're thinking about lenses, we're thinking about them in angle of view. The higher the number of the focal length, the narrower the angle of view. the lower the number, the focal length, the wider the angle of the view. So let's shoot some examples with our model and we can compare the results from using different lenses. That's it, good. Okay, this first lens is the fisheye, and we're going to demonstrate and show you the results of what you get with this lens. That's it, Kirsty. Give me a stronger pose with the leg. That's it, great. Hold it there. You just check that back. That's excellent. Okay, just run through a few poses for me. Okay, good. Turn the body a bit, yeah. Lean up against one of the pillars now for me. That's it. Great. Keep that there. Excellent. All right, I'm just going to go in and get that light behind that pillar. Brilliant. Excellent. Keep it there. Here, using the fisheye lens, we achieved an extremely wide angle of view, and our model appears quite small in the photo, even though I was only shooting from about 3 meters away. That's good. Keep that there. Stay there, Kirsty. That's good. Go. That's it. Beautiful. Keep it there. Great. In this shot with the wide-angle lens, notice how our angle of view has changed and our model has become larger in the photo. That there's lovely. That's a great pose though, excellent, keep that there. A standard lens gave me this angle of view. Okay. That's good. Or maybe just hook the thumb into your pocket, that's it. That's good. And the short telephoto lens has tightened the angle of view even more, but is a very flattering lens for portraiture. Notice how in these shots I was using flash to fill in the shadow side of my pictures. When shooting into the light, using flash can avoid a silhouetted subject. This technique is called fill-in flash and can give a really professional look to your images. To find out more about flash techniques, take a look at one of our advanced level DVDs. Okay, what we've got now is I'm on the short telephoto to telephoto 70-200 lens, and I can't shoot from over there anymore because it's too tight for this lens because it's too much magnification. So I've moved Kirsty down the run of the wooden blocks there. I'm going to shoot with this extra little bit of distance and we'll be able to see the results of that one. That's great, Kirsty, keep that there. Okay, let's have a look what we got there. That's good, perfect. Keep that there for me for a second longer. Good. Yeah, that's a nice run, nice light there, excellent, good. Yeah, that's really nice. Now I've just been using a zoom lens for that series of photographs, but it's important to remember that fixed focal length lenses rather than zoom lenses are actually great lenses to use too, because it forces you with fixed focal length lenses to move around and find new angles and new positions to get a picture from. Sometimes zoom lenses make you a little bit lazy with your photography, and while they're great and while they're quite versatile, remember that fixed focal length lenses are a really good lens to use. They often also have a larger maximum aperture, which is great for gathering more light. And the other benefit of fixed focal length lenses, as well as the maximum aperture, is the fact that quite often they're cheaper than zoom lenses. Light is the magical stuff that we use to create our pictures. It's found all around us and comes from a variety of sources, both natural and man-made. It also comes in many forms and colours, each one affecting the atmosphere of our pictures differently.
To help us understand light, I have broken it down into 4 main categories: transmitted light, reflected light, soft light, and hard light. Hard light comes from any light source that is apparently small. Now, the sun on a clear day is a prime example. Now, we know the sun's not actually small, but it appears small because it's so far away. And it acts like an extremely bright but small light bulb in the sky. Soft light comes from any light source that has a large apparent surface area. Now, a great example of that is like the light we've got right now. And that's where the sun is shining through an overcast sky or a large blanket of cloud. And that large blanket of cloud has now become the large light source. And that large light source is what's giving us the soft light. The characteristics of hard light are that it has a very high contrast. Because of that high contrast, it gives very sharp, hard-edged shadows. It also has a certain sparkle and sharpness to the light because of the high contrast. And it also reveals texture very strongly if the light source is at the right angle. Whereas soft light is very low in contrast and hardly gives any shadows at all. In actual fact, if soft light is used incorrectly, it can look quite dull. So, what type of light is best for photography? Well, right now is what photographers call the magic hour. And that's because it has all the magic ingredients. We've got soft light from this large light source above us, which is the sky. But we've also got hard light from the sun, which is setting over there, and it's cutting through the Earth's atmosphere, so it's reduced in intensity to a much more manageable level. And by combining hard light and soft light, it makes the photographs much more interesting. Now, to add to that, we've also got transmitted light, and that means we can see the light source in the picture. Plus, we've got reflected light reflecting off the surface of the water and off the wet sand. And by putting all of those things together, we're going to get a fantastic image. And if I can just get this piece of driftwood to stay still, I think we're going to get the shot that we want. That's coming together really nicely. Just going to move that over a little bit. Some beautiful reflections off of the bit of wood. It's a little bit too close. Just going to move it back down there. And I want to be quite precise. Oh no, she moved out the way again. Oh, still, that's quite a good result. Quite a good result. We got the water flowing by, got the bit of wood. As you can see, sometimes you need to get your feet wet to get the best shot. For this shot, I was using a super wide angle lens and experimenting in manual mode with shutter speeds from 1 to 6 seconds. I used a small aperture for maximum depth of field. To balance the light in the sky with my darker foreground, I used ND filters, which we look at in depth in our travel and landscape DVD. To understand light better, start looking at it in different situations and try to figure out what you are seeing. Is it hard light, or is it soft light, or is it a combination of the two? For the best light, try to shoot at least half an hour before and after sunset. If the weather conditions are right, then this will usually be the most attractive light of the day.
We'll try a couple more shots before we pack home, and I can change out of these wet socks and shoes. Fantastic.
The magic hour is not the only time or light that we can shoot in.
You can even take advantage of hard light at midday by shooting indoors. I'm going to show you how you can create stunning portraits with nothing more than a window and a reflector for lighting.
Now, a great lighting setup that you can easily use in many different locations, even in your own home, is simply a large window. Now here, we've got Vicky modelling for us, and we're using this large window light to illuminate soft light all the way down the side of Vicky's face. Now, one of the problems when you just side light like this is that the other side of the body will be in shadow. Now, a great way to get around that is simply to use a reflector, and reflectors are great tools. Now, you can get a variety of different reflectors. This one here is a commercially available reflector that just pops open like that, and you can take out on location with you. And then if you look at Vicky's face here, you'll see the difference that that reflector makes as I put that light in and out of the shot like so. So a huge difference. Now it's silver on one side and it's white on the other, so the silver side gives a harsher light. But if you don't want to use a reflector like that, you can even use something as simple as a piece of white card like this. Here I've got a little bit of white board, just a bit of white foam board, and again, watch the result here, what we can do there. So this side of the face is dark and in shadow. Simply bring the white board in and we've got a great reflector, great fill-in panel to illuminate that shadow side for us. So very simple technique, large window, nice soft light, beautiful for portraits, fantastic for portraits, and then simply a reflector on the other side to fill in the shadow side. So I'm going to get Vicky leaning in against this window, and then we're going to use a couple of different reflectors and we're going to see what results we get. Okay, Vicky. That's great. Come down towards me a little bit more. Okay. And head over the other way. That's it. Okay, and pop back again. Sorry, let's just get it. Okay. There, that's it.
This shot uses a white reflector close to our subject. Here the reflector is further away, resulting in less fill light and more shadows. In this shot, no reflector was used at all. And in this shot, the white reflector was close to our model.
Shot. That's it. That's good. Great. Okay, just give me a little hint of a smile there, Vicky. That's it. Good. Just chuck that light there. Perfect. Same pose. That's it. The difference without the reflector and then with the reflector. Without and with. And you can see that even without the reflector can be quite nice. In that case, there's actually a little bit of light bouncing back from the other side of the room anyway, which is filling in a little bit. And then on the one with the reflector, it's almost a bit too strong. So I think what we'll do, Fab, is just get you to go in with the white card this time, but just go from a little bit further away. It's a much softer light, which is fantastic for filling in all those creases in Vicky's face. That's it, good, okay. Excellent. I'm just going to drop that down a little bit. Okay, turn your head towards the window, Vicky. That's it, good, keep that there. That's lovely. You can see from this that the surgeon is going to have to do the reconstructive work around about here, and then probably shrink the nose a little bit, expand the head.
Lift those up.
Yeah, lift those up. Maybe make your fingers longer so that they drag on the floor like an orangutan, which would probably suit you quite well.
Far off.
But yeah, so I think it's worked out quite nicely. For the picture on the left, we used a white reflector from approximately 2 meters away, giving a slight fill to the shadow side of our image. For the shot on the right, the reflector was moved further away, resulting in a stronger shadow. Notice how in both shots I have used a large aperture to blur the background, concentrating the attention on our subject.
Resolution, formats, megapixels, medium, ISO. It all sounds a bit confusing when you're starting out in photography, but don't worry, it's fairly straightforward. The medium is simply the device that we capture or record light onto. Now traditionally it was film like this, but more commonly now it's a CCD chip, and we get CCD chips inside our digital cameras like this one here. ISO is the sensitivity to light of our recording medium. So just as different films came in different sensitivity to light, our CCD chips can be adjusted in sensitivity to that light. Now the format is simply the size of the recording medium. So here we've got quite a large CCD chip comparative to this one in a camera such as this digital SLR. So that makes a camera like this a large format camera compared to this one. And then resolution is the amount of data or detail that our CCD chip or our medium can capture. Now that resolution is often referred to as the amount of pixels that we can record in an image. And it's the amount of pixels that let us know how big we can blow that picture up to and how much data we can finally reveal. Now to give you a better idea of what a pixel actually is, I'm going to zoom in on this picture and show you the area that makes up one pixel. So if I zoom in on the model's eye, we'll gradually start to see tiny little squares appearing. There we go, we can see them now. And as I get into maximum resolution there, we can see that each one of these tiny squares is an actual pixel. And that there is the pupil of the model in the photograph. So you can see how far zoomed in we are and how many pixels it takes to make up a high resolution picture. Now, cameras come in different amounts of pixels. Here we have an 8 megapixel camera. Now a megapixel means 1 million pixels. So this camera can record an image of 8 million pixels that make up the final photograph. Here we have one that's 22 megapixel, 22 million pixels. And then we can go even higher than that with these studio cameras that have got about 40 or more megapixels of data. Now, to give you a better idea of what megapixels mean on different cameras and to show you the results, I'm going to shoot a little experiment so that we can compare the different megapixel counts in the pictures. Okay, what we're doing here is I'm taking a close-up picture on Fabian's eye with a macro lens. And I've got the word Google, or the image of Google, on the screen there so that I can pick up that reflection in Fabian's eye. This is Fabian, our assistant. Say hello, Fabian. And we're going to get a very highly magnified shot of her eye. I'm going to take that on this 22 megapixel camera, and then I'm going to repeat that and take it on this 8 megapixel camera, and then we'll be able to compare the results of those different megapixel counts. So I've basically got a light shining in here reflecting off the screen to add a little bit of light into the eye, and we're going to just get you into position there, please, Fab. That's it. Okay, that's good. Hold it there for me. I'm just going to readjust my focus. That's good. Let me just keep that there nice and still for me. Good. Because we're just shooting with ambient light as opposed to flash, so just nice and still. That's it. Excellent. Good. Excellent, it's quite a nice result. Just brush your hair on the right hand side there a little bit, that's it, good. Okay, and then lean back in there for me. That's perfect. Lean back slightly away from the computer, good. Okay, keep that there for me a second. I'm just going to move the camera in a little bit closer to you. That's it, good, excellent. Right, we've got the word Google in there quite nicely. Nice and still, Fab, that's it, good. Okay, stay still for me so I can just adjust the focus on your eye, because I've got the reflection of your eyelashes in the eye. Nice and still, stay still, still, that's it, good, excellent. And again, yep, good. Let me just check that. Excellent. Okay, so what I'll do now is I'm going to swap cameras and repeat that exercise on the lower resolution camera. Okay, Fab, into position again for me. That's it, just
Hold it there. And again, nice and still. Excellent, nice and still. Okay, great. Once you've taken your photographs, you need some way of looking at them on your computer system. Now, your camera would have come with some software that would allow you to do that. And you can attach your camera directly to your computer with the cabling that comes with it, and that will allow you to plug in a lead like this directly into your camera to transfer the images from the camera to the computer and view the images in the software that was provided with your camera, or with alternative software that's also available. Another method of taking the images from the camera is to take the camera's memory card out of the camera like so, and then we can take the memory card and we can transfer the information from a card reader such as this one by plugging the card into a memory card reader like so, and that is also an alternative method of taking the images across to the computer. Now, once you've got your images in the computer, it allows you to work on them, manipulate them, change things like color, saturation and exposure levels, and just tweak them a little bit. Now, I've already downloaded the images from our shots that we've just done, and here we're going to look at the results. So what we're looking at here is the pixel count. We're going to see the difference between the 8 megapixel and the 22 megapixel camera, just so we can get an idea of what sort of quality level we're talking about in difference between two different resolutions like that. So, first of all, on my right, I have the 8 megapixel version, and we can see that's giving a really good result. I'm just going to zoom out. We've got the word Google reflected nicely in the eye, just as we wanted. We've got a nice glow from the light on the hair there, and the glow from the computer screen is also being picked up on the face. Very shallow depth of field because we're working at a very high magnification, and at higher magnifications we do end up with shallower depth of field. If we look at the 22 megapixel, I'm just going to put that into full screen mode here, and just look at that quality of that image. Isn't that fantastic? I'm going to zoom right in. There we go. Look at that. Superb. Right into the letter G there, and bear in mind that's just a reflection in the eye. Now we're starting to get into the individual pixels. There we go. We're right in there. Each one of those is a pixel. This image is made up of 22 million of those little squares. And we zoom out, we can see how much detail has been captured in that shot. Absolutely fantastic. Now, if we compare the results of the 22 megapixel and the 8 megapixel, let's have a look how much resolution, how much data has been captured. So if I zoom in now on that one, I'll bring this one up to the same level, you'll see that the tonal range in the 22 megapixel one is a lot smoother and a lot cleaner. Here we can start to see a little bit noise, a little bit less data has been captured. There's a little bit more artifacts appearing in our image. If we zoom in a little bit further, let's go into about, actually let's go back one click there and zoom in on that one. Here again you can see clearly the smoothness on the edge of our reflected letter G here, and it's a little bit more jagged on that one. But bear in mind that is still a stunning result for an 8 megapixel camera, because if I look at the whole image, this is the 8 megapixel version image, whilst it's slightly more noisy, slightly more deteriorated in quality than the 22 megapixel, it's still superb and would allow you to blow up the image to at least a 16 by 20 inch print and give you a really good result. So there we can see perfectly acceptable result even with an 8 megapixel camera. Now when it comes to image quality, it doesn't just stop with pixels and megapixels. One important factor to remember is ISO. Now ISO is the ability to change the sensitivity to light of our digital sensor in our camera. It allows us to boost its sensitivity so that we can capture more light than we would be able to capture at the standard setting. Now, in the old days when we were using film
film came in different sensitivities to light. So you'd have a 100 speed film, a 200, a 400, an 800 and so on. Now, on digital cameras, you can change that sensitivity just like you did with changing the film, but you can change it at any moment you like when you're shooting with a digital camera. And you simply access the camera's menu, go into the ISO setting, select set, and then you select the ISO speed that you'd like to work at. So you're selecting the sensitivity to light of the sensor, of the CCD chip that you'd like to work with. Now on this particular camera here, it's changed in a slightly different method. They're all different, but they have simply somewhere where you can push ISO and you can change the numbers to choose the required ISO setting. Okay, now you're probably wondering, well, what use is that to me? What advantage is using different ISOs? Well, ISO, as I said, allows us to shoot in different lighting conditions. If we were shooting with a standard ISO and the light was very low, we might find ourselves with a slow shutter speed and already at maximum aperture. Now, if that was the case, we might find ourselves in a situation where we're not able to even take the picture because we don't have a tripod, we can't shoot with any slower shutter speed as the result would give us camera shake in the shot, and we can't choose a more larger aperture because we're already at maximum aperture. Now, by changing the ISO to a more sensitive setting, we can boost the amount of exposure that we're getting. So it's like increasing the amount of available f-stops, increasing the amount of available exposure. So when we change from a 100 to a 200 ISO, we've doubled the amount of light that we can capture. So it's like opening the aperture by one full f-stop. If we go from 200 to 400 ISO, we've doubled the amount of light that we can capture again. So changing from 100 to 200 to 400, to 200, 400, 800, 1600. So changing from 100 to 1600 ISO will allow us 4 f-stops of extra available light to shoot with. Now that can make a huge difference when we're taking pictures. In this instance, when we were doing these shots, I was shooting at 200 ISO at about an 1/8 of a second. Now, an 1/8 of a second was very slow if we were shooting handheld. It wouldn't have been feasible, especially on such a close-up macro shot as these. But as you saw, we had the picture braced, the camera braced on a tripod, everything was kept solid in place. So an 1/8 of a second was actually okay for this. But if we had increased the ISO from 200 to 1600, that would have given us 3 stops more light to work with, and that would have taken our shutter speed from an 1/8 of a second to a 15th, to a 30th, to a 60th of a second. So you can see how important and useful ISO boost can be for us. It allows us to find a shutter speed that we can actually work with when we're shooting in difficult conditions. Now, you're probably wondering why. If that's the case, why don't we shoot with higher ISO settings all the time? Because if it gives us extra light and it gives us the ability to work in lower light conditions, then why not take advantage of that in all circumstances? Well, it's a good point. But there is a problem with higher ISO settings, and that is a slight degradation in the quality of our image. When we boost the sensitivity of the CCD sensor, we actually deteriorate the image quality by a little bit. Now, to show you that deterioration, I shot some of those pictures earlier at both different ISO settings, one at 200 ISO and one at 1600 ISO. Now, if we look at the results, you'll see quite clearly here on the left, this is the 8 megapixel camera, and this is it with the 200 ISO, and on the right, this is the 1600 ISO version at 8 megapixel. Now, you can just see on this one that the grain and noise in the image is slightly greater than it is in that one, but it's still a very good result considering. But if I zoom in a little bit further, you'll start to see now quite a lot more noise appearing in the image. And if you look at the word Google reflecting in the eye there, here you can clearly see a breakdown in the pixels. They start to get a lot more noise in them, a lot more color distortion, and the image doesn't have that smoothness that our 8 megapixel version has there. So that is the trade-off in quality when we boost the ISO. However, if we look at the 1600 ISO image in full screen, We can see there, yes, it does have quite a bit of noise in the shot, but if we zoom back out, we can still see that at that sort of size there, it's still a very usable image. So whilst we do suffer degradation in image quality, it's important to remember that sometimes by boosting the ISO, it will allow us to actually capture a shot that we might not otherwise have been able to. Remember back at the start of this program when I told you about the 6 essential requirements that we needed to record an image. Now so far we've covered most of those. We've looked at light and we've looked at how to get the best light, soft light, hard light, transmitted light and reflected light. We've also looked at the best times of day for light. Now we've looked at optics and we've looked at lenses and different angles of view. We've looked at the aperture and we've learned how that hole controls the amount of light that we capture through onto our medium, but it also controls depth of field. We've looked at time and how we use the shutter speed to control the amount of time that we capture and how we can use that for creative effect, or whether we freeze action or whether we blur the action by using long shutter speeds. And we've looked at the medium, and the medium was our recording material, whether that was film or CCD, and we looked at ISO and basically how we can adjust the sensitivity. But there's one thing that we haven't covered, one of the 6 basic essential requirements, and that is the subject. Now the subject we define as composition, and that basically means how we lay the picture out, or how we position our subject or position ourselves in relation to the subject to get the most aesthetically pleasing result in our pictures. Now in front of me here I've got an array of pictures that we've taken throughout this program, some of the pictures we've taken throughout this program, and what I want to do today is talk about composition and how we've applied certain rules to composition to get the certain results, because so far throughout this program I haven't explained anything to do with composition. So I'm going to show you a few guideline tips to do with composition that will help you get better images. So if we look at this image here, this is a shot that I took in India several years ago, and this picture basically follows the rules of composition. Now these rules are called the rules of third, and what I've got here is an acetate sheet which I'm just going to place over this picture, and I'm going to just draw on top of that. Now basically the rule of thirds mean that we can split the picture into 1/3 zones. So if I draw through this picture like so, here, here and here, and I've split this into approximately 1/3 zones. And what you'll notice is that the important element or important parts of the picture fall on the 1/3 lines. I've got my horizon line here, I've got the Taj Mahal on that 1/3, I've got the reflection of the Taj Mahal on that 1/3 zone, and then I've got the man, the figure of the subject in there, also falling on the 1/3 zone. So by breaking your picture into 1/3 zones, you can use it as a compositional aid to help you lay out your picture, because the eye finds this particular layout much more pleasing than, say, putting your subject right in the middle of your picture. And if we look at the points of interest, we can see that they fall on the intersection zones on the 1/3 zones. So what about that applied to some of the pictures that we've taken already on this program? Well, here's one of our landscape shots, and if I apply that onto here, we can see that our main areas of interest, we've got the main areas of rock with the detail in the rocks, and the areas here with the green weed, and this area of rock and water moving around, also falling on those 1/3 zones. If we look at the shot that we did, one section on light,
look what happens here as well. We've got the horizon on the 1/3 zone, we've got the rocks falling into that point on the 1/3 zone, and we've also got our important piece of driftwood falling in on the 1/3 zone, and we've got the horizon over on this side coming across on the 1/3 zone. So you can see that we've applied those techniques to many of the pictures that we've shot. Even on the studio shots, if we look at the positioning here, the model's eyes are falling on the 1/3 zone, the body and most of the head is coming in on a 1/3 zone. So you can see how those basic guidelines of using the rule of thirds work to good effect. Even when the shot's taken in a vertical format like this one, which we used when we demonstrated long shutter speeds, you can see that my main boulder and pebble is falling on the 1/3 zone along with this other pebble here. My horizon is on the top third, and these rocks on this side are also falling at that intersection of a 1/3 zone. So the 1/3 or the 1/3 rule is a really important guide to getting great composition, and it's something that you can apply easily to all your photography. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go out and we're going to shoot another picture example, but we're going to apply all of the techniques that we've learned so far about light, optics, angle of view and shutter speeds. We're also going to talk about composition, and we're going to apply everything for one final picture so that we can see it all coming together. This fantastic location has lots of angles, clean lines and interesting architecture that will help create great composition. Here I'm using one of my assistants to work out the composition of my shot. This way I will have a good idea of what I'm going to shoot when the model is ready. Okay, so what I've got here is fantastic composition. I'm using the elements of this metalwork and the corner piece coming into the right hand side of my shot, and then this silver wall of metal running down the back with these two towers just poking up the top with this blue sky. And I'm going to shoot this on a super wide angle setting of about 16-20mm to really exaggerate that perspective. And I'm going to position the model on the left hand side so that it almost looks like this section of metal is pointing towards the model. And we've got a couple of flashes on the battery pack which is going to be illuminating the model down this side, and the remainder of the scene is going to be reduced in exposure. I'm going to underexpose that and take the ambient exposure down. So I've got to start off with a few test shots first and then make some adjustments to the light, and I'm already quite confident that the composition is going to work really, really well on this one. Right, let's get this light up higher and just round a little bit, and John, let's move yours round a little bit as well. So let's just go over to there, stop there, that's it. Let's take yours over to there.
As well as the rule of thirds as a guide, I'm also looking to make the picture more dynamic by combining other compositional elements into my picture, such as leading lines which will draw the viewer into the picture, and layers that will provide a sense of depth to my shot. This is very important because your final photograph is two-dimensional, and you need to bring back a sense of 3 dimensions to your audience.
Good.
As well as depth, I'm also looking to create an interesting balance of subjects and an unusual balance of light to invoke a slightly surreal scene. Here I'm using flash to help achieve that, but you could also use reflectors to bounce the light back into the shadow side of your subject. The type of flash I am using can only synchronize with my camera at shutter speeds of up to 1/250th of a second, which means too much daylight will reach my medium with the aperture I've selected. So I'm using neutral density filters to bring my daylight exposure down to a manageable level. That way I can shoot with a large aperture that I need to keep my background towers slightly out of focus. I'm also using a polarizing filter to help saturate the colors in my picture.
There, good, keep it there, that's it.
Using flash is a more complicated area of photography that we can't cover properly in this program, but you can easily learn more about filters and flash in one of our advanced level or Pro Series DVDs. Visit our website at carltaylorphotography.com for more information.
Try down there, looking down there, that's it. Just look down towards this tower, that's it. Good. Okay, great. Right, just relax for a minute. I'm just gonna check what we're getting.
So let's take a look at my final shot and the compositional elements. Here we can see that I followed the rule of thirds fairly closely in this example, but if we study the picture even further, we can see other elements which make this a great shot. On the right we have the metal framework that draws our eye towards the model, and the glow of light on the metal wall. The super wide angle lens also exaggerated the perspective of my shot as intended and gave me some great lines in the floor leading towards the model. I'm also really pleased with the sense of depth achieved in the image, with all the layers that make up the shot, including the metal frame, the model, the wall and the towers in the background. And there is a nice link between these layers in the dark objects in the shot. I also used a large aperture to keep the towers slightly less sharp than the rest of my shot, to exaggerate the sense of depth. The angle of the wall with its leading lines helps achieve scale as it draws away into the distance. It complements the metal framework, which has leading lines going in the opposite direction. All of this exaggerated perspective has been achieved by using a super wide angle lens. I also chose a dress that had a slightly metallic sparkle to complement the large metallic surfaces in the image. And the simplicity of fairly neutral colours helps the eye and brain digest the information more easily. Often, good composition is a complex process made to look simple. People viewing the final picture don't necessarily know why they like it, it just has a feeling about it that captures their imagination. More complex composition is something that does take time to learn, but the more you practice, the easier it gets. Often it's a case of going with your instincts on what feels right, and while some people have a more natural ability at identifying good composition, it is still something you can learn. Here are a few other shots from the day. To see step by step how these were shot and lit, check out some of our Pro Series DVDs. To further improve your knowledge of photography, visit our website and take a look at some of the next level titles in our range. Thanks for watching and good luck with your photography. Remember to get out there and practice what is a fascinating subject, or may even one day become your future career.